Father Ockerse. You've joined me back in the lounge room. It really seems like it's been a long time since we've sat down together to record an episode, so it's great to have you back on this relatively warm Sunday afternoon. How are you?
I'm quite well, Thomas, and it certainly has been a while. There's just so much going on, isn't there? It's a bit hard to tee up the time when we're both free.
It certainly has, but here we are, and I am really looking forward to the conversation that we're having today. So I'm going to open it up by asking, is heaven full? Is there a point in anybody on earth trying to get to heaven when I think I'd be safe in saying there are people that believe that heaven is full? There's 144,000 people who are, predestined that they're going to get into heaven. Now, but giving that a little bit more of the context that we're going to be talking about, I think it's this idea of predestination, that when we sort of step back, that God foresees and our sort of destinies are set, and that I guess you could say our paths are set in stone. So what is the actual idea that underpins this thing called predestination? Take it away, Father.
Well, Tom, this is certainly going to be a difficult question, but I knew it was going to be, even when we first began. And is heaven full? Well, obviously God knows how many the elect will be, what that number will be. And we do have this text in the book of the Apocalypse that talks about the number of those who are signed with the sign of God and that are called into heaven. And the number that is thrown around there is 144,000. But the commentators do say that that's not the exact number of the elect, that's just a symbolic number that's used in the Apocalypse by St. John. So there's certainly a certain number of those who shall be saved. And when that number is reached, general teaching of theologians is that that's the point at which heaven's at its capacity, not because it couldn't hold any more, but because that's what God has said. He said that those are the ones who will be saved. So from that point of view, yeah, I suppose you could say heaven's full, but it doesn't raise a whole lot of other questions, because as soon as you start saying things like, well, God foresees so many to get into heaven, and then that's it, it's no more are going to enter in, it starts raising questions of free will. Are we truly free and be able to get to heaven, or are we not free? Is it somehow that our eternal destiny is just set irrevocably so, and that there's no possibility of changing that eternal destiny?
I think that would, because I think that would be it from the, trying to take this idea and go, why would anybody actually care about this, and what practical application does it have in any of our lives? Well, it's an idea that I think a lot of even non-religiously interested people are familiar with, this idea that Christians especially have this thing called predestination, where I guess you'd call it divinely orientated fate, where God knows the choices you're going to make and where you will end up. And it's really interesting that it sort of conflicts with that idea we have of free will, but where it would become interesting would be if, depending on what form predestination takes, why would we bother? Like, I think it was Martin Luther sort of took that to its absolute extreme when he sort of said, this could have been something different, but I think he sort of said sin and sin boldly, because, that was taking salvation to its, wrong extent and wrong interpretation and wrong extreme.
Certainly every heresy to some extent has tried to grapple with these realities that we're dealing with here, that we know some from faith and we know some things from reason. And sometimes the reconciliation of those things is not immediately self-evident. And the human mind isn't like that. The human mind is of such a bent or such a nature that it really likes to have things cut and dried. It likes to classify things into boxes. It likes numbers because numbers are absolute. It likes this kind of mathematical certitude. And when you start talking about things which are somewhat above reason, not necessarily contradictory to reason, and in fact, the truths of the faith cannot be contradictory to reason in as much as they come from God, who's the source also of reality. But they are above reason. such that reason's not able to give a complete cut and dried explanation or classify them necessarily or things like that, all of a sudden it becomes something very difficult. And in this quest of trying to find a perfect rational explanation or being able to put things in boxes or such like, all sorts of heresies begin to arise. And one of the common things in nearly every heresy is the denial of free will, because to hold on the one hand the free will of man, and on the other hand to hold this eternal foreknowledge of God, is very hard to reconcile. It's very hard, and it's not because of any intrinsic contradiction between these two notions of the free will of man and the eternal foreknowledge of God. It's more the failure or the weakness of our human intellect to be able to visualize or understand the question of the eternal foreknowledge of God. That's something which is just so completely outside of our experience that we just don't have the words to talk about it, and we don't have the concepts to really properly summarize it or discuss it. It becomes very, very difficult. Mm-hmm. For us, it seems that if you make a world and you know what's going to happen with those creatures in the world that you make, it seems to us that you've designed it, you've made a plan, and that plan cannot allow for free will. It's not possible for us, from our point of view, to give free will to rational creatures in some world that you create and still achieve the plan that you wish at the end. Mm-hmm. And we know this all the time. We beat our heads on the wall in frustration with different people at different moments in our life because we want them to do something, and their free will just won't do what we want them to do. Mm. You see it with parents, you see it with educators, you want children to do something, they just won't do it because their free will is doing something else, and you're not achieving what you're wanting to achieve because the free will just keeps frustrating us. And it seems to us that has to be the same with God, but the fact is that God's on a infinitely much higher plane. We're always going to be exterior to someone's free will, whereas God is not exterior to man. God is the creator of man, and he holds man in existence. And it turns out that even the very freedom of man, his free will, is made by God. So that God's actually the one who supports that free choice. For us to be able to freely choose, we need the I forget the exact theological term, but we need that co-assistance, or that God needs to be there. He needs to be involved for that decision to be truly free. Okay. And that's in itself also becomes a problem for people. And it is in some ways certainly a mystery. It's something that we cannot fully understand, that there can be a perfect harmony between, on the one hand, the fact that we need God to cooperate, and on the other hand, that the choice that we make is entirely ours and free.
So the church is very clear, and this is a question, that, how would you say it, salvation is ultimately, I don't want to say this incorrectly, but I'll say it anyway, and I'll let you pick up the pieces and correct me. Salvation is in the hands of the individual. This idea that free will, every individual has the ability, the right, and the choice to make a choice between a good and an evil. Because I think the idea of predestination, taken in its most morbid sense, would be that the second somebody is born, they're on this narrow railroad that starts here and goes and ends here, either in heaven or in hell, regardless of what little detours they take. They're stuck on this track. And that, is that correct?
We have to start making distinctions, because the fact is that yes, salvation is an individual choice. One individually chooses to accept the plan of God or to not accept it. And there's consequences of accepting or not accepting. We've spoken about this, I think, several times, about this whole question of there's consequences to whether we accept reality or not. There's a consequence to whether I accept to drive on the right side of the road or whether I don't. There's going to be a different result. Either I'm going to arrive at my destination safely, or I'm going to, if I'm lucky, arrive in a hospital in a fairly bad state. And there's always consequences to those choices. And so the individual can freely choose to be saved, to accept the plan of God, or freely choose not to be saved, to not accept the plan of God. That's the one side of it. The other side is that God knows what that individual is going to choose, and God knows where that individual is going to end up. That's clearly in the mind of God. And the thing where it gets really complicated, because those two things, if that's all it was, we could find some rational way to understand that. But the problem is it gets a little bit more complicated in that not only does God know what choices we're going to make, but insofar as we make the right choices and insofar as we choose salvation, he has to be directly involved with each one of those choices to give us the necessary graces to make those decisions. And that's where it gets really, really sticky, because we call that, on the one hand, sufficient grace, and on the other hand, efficacious grace. So sufficient grace, everybody has. Everybody has sufficient grace to make the right choices, but not everybody's given the efficacious grace, which actually puts that choice into action to choose the right thing.
And why?
That's the sticky point. Why?
What factors go into that? Does everybody at a base level receive the same potential to get those graces? And is it a result of choices made, or is it just God's will beyond our understanding that some are more equal than others?
Look, there's an immense mystery. There's a profundity of mystery here that we actually don't know how all these things work in the plan of God. What we do know is that God's infinitely merciful and that God's infinitely just. So nobody is punished by damnation to hell unless it's their fault. And we also know that nobody is rewarded in heaven except by the mercy of God. How it all works is something which has never been defined by the church. There's been many arguments, especially a famous argument in the Middle Ages between the Franciscans, I think. No, the Dominicans and the Jesuits. So not quite the Middle Ages, a bit later on. A fairly intense argument. And it got quite vitriolic, you could say. And at some point, the Holy Father stepped in. The Pope said, listen, you're not allowed to discuss this question anymore. So there wasn't any decision given. It was just simply accept the teaching of the church. You're not allowed to discuss how grace and free will works anymore. That's it. It's finished. Because we can't go any further. There's a ceiling that you reach in the understanding of theological truth. And so, well, beyond here is the mystery. And as St. Thomas Aquinas would say, from here on, you stop disputing and you start adoring. Because we simply cannot understand any further. We've reached the limits of the human intellect ability in this life to understand all those parts of God's plan. But the parts that we do understand have a lot of instruction in them for us. I mean, for instance, St. Thomas's definition of predestination is simply the love that God has for his rational creatures. It's really simple as that. He says that God has this loving care by which he guides all his creatures. It extends to every single thing that he's made, including the inanimate creatures, because they are works of his hands. But there's a special love or special loving care by which he guides those who are the elect, who are predestinated to heaven. And that's the predestination. It's this love of predilection that God, before any merit of our own, that God chooses to love us more, chooses to give us more helps and more graces, and especially here we're talking about the efficacious grace that will lead and guide those souls to heaven. And yet at the same time, that depends on the free will of man to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And the mystery is that we can't see exactly how those two things go together at the same time. That's where the mystery is. Yeah, so we've got to kind of hang on to the parameters or the guidelines of truth that we have, but the complete reconciliation of those truths is the bit that's difficult for us to understand. That's where further dispute is just not helpful. It doesn't encourage in us that true attitude that we should have to the will of God, because of course the question's always going to arise that if there's this plan that God has, and if he's freely chosen certain individuals to love them more, then what use is there for me to do any good? Shouldn't I just give up? Because how do I know if I'm one of these predilected of God? How do I know? I don't. The bottom line is that each individual has to act in such a way as to make themselves worthy of those graces of God and to utilize those graces of God. Because to each and every one is offered the opportunity, even though some are going to simply say no. And it's an extraordinary thing.
Okay.
You just can't get any more clarity. It's the limits of what we can understand.
I've got two final things maybe to bring this discussion to a close. I'm going to ask you to comment on a metaphor that somebody once gave me for sort of trying to understand the concept of predestination, while allowing for, they acknowledge to be limitations and imperfections of the metaphor, but almost the play written by the playwright, that all the characters within the play are carrying out their own roles, and they make choices to bring that play to its climax and its fruition. But all those
may even have been written by G.K. Chesterton. I think he wrote
probably was possibly, yeah. But ultimately, the choices of the individuals are designed by the playwright. And even would a limitation to that metaphor still be that really free will within the context of that is still sort of limited, because you've got good people and bad people, and they're always going to be the same, the same villains and the same heroes, and they're sort of hardwired to those choices, where that may not necessarily be the way. I think in a previous episode you've said nobody is pure evil, so everybody has this radical capacity, no matter how bad they are, for good choices. It's just a matter of actually making those good choices.
Look, the reality is that in this life there is no such thing as absolute perfection, and there's no such thing as absolute evil. There's always a mixture in everyone, even in those who strive to work according to the graces of God. There's always some failing. There's always some falling short of the divine ideal. And even in those who are evil, we still find acts of goodness, albeit most of the time a purely natural goodness. But we still find certain redeeming features. So there's no absolute evil in it. But to come back to the metaphor, every metaphor, every way of explaining something by comparing it to something else is always going to limp in some way, because we're using something which is totally foreign to what we're talking about. And we're saying, well, but there is this aspect about it, which is kind of like what we're talking about. And so in that aspect, there's a similarity there. But in the rest of it, there's no similarity. And so it's always going to fall short. And so what we always say, every metaphor is going to limp. That's or every simile is going to limp. There's going to be some aspect of it which doesn't quite match up to the reality. So yeah, we can come up with ways to try and explain how we can keep free will, and we can keep the divine foreknowledge of God, and not just foreknowledge, but even his action in leading souls to heaven. But no matter how we do that, no matter how we explain it, precisely because it's a mystery, there's always going to be some aspect of it which does limp, and some aspect of it which is going to give us the wrong idea to a certain extent. It's always going to be the case.
Okay. Final
question. A little bit like sorry, it just occurred to me. It's a little bit like that story of the 5 blind men and the elephant. They each feel the elephant, and one of them's like, well, the elephant's like a rope, and it's because he just felt the tail. And he's, well, no, he's like a wall because he felt the side of it. No, he's like a pillar, and he's felt the leg. No, he's like, he feels the trunk. Another one feels the ear. They all get a different aspect of it, and from the point of view that they're looking at it, it's true. From the whole thing, there's definitely problems with their picture of reality. And so that's how it is with us. I mean, we look at these truths, and it's like it's just too big for us to see. We're like these blind men kind of groping around, and we feel a little bit or understand a little bit of the truth, and we can see the guide rails or the parameters of what's true on either side. But to try and put those together is always going, there's so much that we don't see and so much that we don't know and understand, because we're talking about an infinite being. We're talking about a being who has mystery upon mystery that we will never be able to fully comprehend, we'll never be able to completely understand. There's always going to be some limitation to our knowledge and understanding of God, and consequently there's always going to be some darkness, if you like, or some obscurity, especially in this life, with regard to these great truths of the faith.
The final question I have for you, Father, is if we look at that passage from Scripture about the 12,000 and the 12,000 and the 12,000 and la-di-da-di-da-di-da, and it adds up to 144,000, is the official position of the church, I don't want to hold you to anything here, this is just a mere curiosity on my part, are there more than 144,000 spots to be filled in heaven.
Yeah, well, look, we did touch a little bit on that at the beginning, and my understanding from what I remember, and it is difficult to keep the whole breadth of moral and dogmatic theology and then scriptural studies and all these things in one's mind. This is why people specialize in different areas. But my understanding that I recall is that there certainly are more. What the exact understanding of what St. John meant, I'm not 100% sure. I couldn't say unless I went and consulted the exegetes and saw what they say. But my understanding is that the Catholic position is there's certainly more than that set 144, because that's not a lot of people over the whole breadth of. It is certainly held by many Catholic theologians that the vast majority of men are damned. Certainly, some Catholic theologians say that. And that's, of course, a chilling thought. But, I mean, it's not particularly surprising if you look around the world today, for example. But for so many people, they've deliberately chosen the path that they've gone down. It's not something which they're not necessarily just a victim of circumstance. But they are people who have very difficult circumstances. But God always gives to those people special graces. He never puts them in a difficult circumstance without this opportunity or this way out of it. And it always comes down to a personal choice. Individuals have to make personal choices. And this is why we say things all the time. We don't really think about the truth of it. But we say, for example, you can't help someone if they don't want to help themselves. And it's so true. The reality is that even God is not going to force an individual to choose salvation. He's going to give them the opportunity. He's going to give them the graces, but he's never going to force their free will. He's going to give them that opportunity, but he's going to respect the creation that he's made. And by making us free, he's left the option open for us to not choose him, to not choose happiness. And he's going to respect that choice if we make that choice.
Could you say that it's almost one of those things that it can be dangerous to spend too much time thinking about, and that to sort of take it simply as our job is to wake up in the morning, understand that we have free will, and that free will is given to us so that we can distinguish between good and evil, choose good, avoid evil, and act in a way consistent with that pattern to get to heaven.
You're spot on the money. And this is exactly why the Pope said to the Jesuits and Dominicans, and this is squabbling that does nobody any good. Because at the end of the day, it's a mystery which we cannot fully understand. There's just no ways we can come to resolution of this. But we do know some basic facts, and we need to work according to that knowledge. And the fact that God is infinitely merciful, he is infinitely just. He does give to every single soul the sufficient grace is necessary to save their souls. He does work out all things for the good of us, his rational creatures. And we have to cooperate with those graces, because salvation is an option for everyone. And we just need to work with that. There's that in the Imitation of Christ, there's this story that's related of some religious who's just wrapped himself in knots over this exact question and threw himself down before the altar in the church and just said, if only I should know if I was saved. And our Lord responded to him and said, well, if you did know, what difference would it make for you? What would you do differently? And
that's interesting, because I guess in that perspective, it's a good thing to bear in the back of your mind. It's a good incentive.
What would you do differently if you knew that you were going to be saved at the end? You would still say your prayers. You would still be trying to do good and avoid evil, because you know that that's how you get there. So it's not going to change. It's not going to change anything. We still have this individual battle that we have to fight. And by fighting that individual battle, we obtain salvation. I mean, our Lord Jesus Christ made it very obvious and very simple in the gospel. He simply said, he who perseveres until the end shall be saved. I mean, that's extraordinary, because he could have said, that he who does great works shall be saved. He who has great virtues shall be saved. He who is chosen by me shall be saved. But he didn't say any of those things. He simply said, he who perseveres shall be saved. So it really does come down to that daily grind. And I think that is something that we need constant reminding of, precisely because of the fact that, I spoke about this tendency of the human mind to put things into classifications. It has another tendency, which is always to think that somehow the extraordinary is where it's at. We like reading stories of great saints because they did extraordinary things, they're great miracles, and this is good stuff. We like that. But living a daily life, doing one's daily duty, not so much of interest to us, and yet it's obviously something that's very important to God. But not only because he said, "He who perseveres to the end shall be saved," but he himself in his own life on this earth, he spent 30 years of it doing, from our point of view and from the world's point of view, absolutely nothing.
Mm.
If he's come into the world to save mankind and come into the world to preach to the world, 30 years in Nazareth is completely, if not contrary to it, at least not helping in any sort. And of course, the last 3 years of our Lord's life, when he's in this public ministry, preaching and working miracles, I mean, that's more in accordance with what we think. And yet we never stop. There's Father Boylan who makes this point. He says, the really astounding thing about the public life of our Lord is not the miracles that he did work. It's in fact, if you consider that he had the infinite power at his command, the infinite power of God. So the really astounding thing is the miracles that he could have worked but didn't. The great things that he could have done, but he never did it. And he had at his disposal this immense power. He had at his disposal the greatest mind, the greatest intellect that the world has ever known, the greatest wealth of knowledge, the greatest teaching ability, the greatest talent at everything, and yet just doesn't seem to have registered in the plan of God. It seems that in God's mind, what was so much more important was just the everyday doing one's duty, but doing it really well. And that's what God has promised salvation to. And so I think what we need to take away from considering the doctrine of predestination, considering the fact that it is a manifestation or part of God's plan to save souls, is that it works out in our lives by this application to doing what we're doing at the time that we're doing it, as well as we can for the love of God, and not to get distracted by the showy or the dramatic or whatever. To me, that's really the crux of it. It is something which has a profound effect on our spiritual lives. If we change a whole attitude, a whole point of view, that we see things how God sees them, rather than to see things from the way that we'd like to see them. It comes down, doesn't it, to the same question of reality. We have to accept things the way they are. We can't make our own realities. We can't do it in the material world. We can't do it in the spiritual world.
And you mentioned final perseverance, and I think that's one of those things that makes perfect sense, is very simple, but is quite scary and difficult when you look at it in reality. And somebody recently told me, I think to give some context to how important final perseverance is when comparing it to the life of Christ. And you may have heard this, but Christ left his public life to, was it the last 3 years? And then the last 3 days, and then the last 3 hours on the cross.
Yes.
It was this 3, and this sort of exponentially decreasing segment where in the last 3 hours of his life were the most important. And in terms of taking that and applying that in our lives, talk about stealing heaven at the good thief at the 11th hour, and they're relying on the mercy of God. God is all merciful, but this reality that you can't always do that, and that it's a very sobering thought. I think it's quite frightening.
And I think you're bringing that up is actually good, because St. Augustine does make the comment about these two thieves on either side of our Lord. And he says, the one on the one hand is given to us that we should not despair, that even should we have been the greatest sinners and come to the end, and it's the end of the road, and it seems that from here on there's only eternal damnation, one act of generosity, just turning to God and opening one's soul, is enough for God to be able to take us and just change our life around. But on the other hand, you had this other man who persisted in his evil. He remained obdurate. And so he's given to us, St. Augustine says, so that we may not presume upon the mercy of God. So it's having these two things. We can never let go of one or the other. We have to have both if we wish to be saved. It's just something that's so very important. It's really the essence of Christianity. It's what it's all about. We're not here to achieve great things. we're not here to do great things. We're here simply to love God and to follow his commandments. That's what we're here for. And to persevere in doing that, always on the one hand, fearing that we should lose our souls, and on the other hand, always trusting in the mercy of God. Having both of these things are like the two guide rails that just keep us on the path of that predestination. And that's how it's realized in individual souls.
Father, that was great. Excellent. Good to have you back. That was a great one to bounce back. I mean, it's been a little while since we've done one, and I think that was one of those really curly questions that it was a great way to bounce back. I think next time I might ask you something like, how many angels can you fit on the head of a needle, or something like that? One of those really important...
We've advanced theological knowledge in the last few centuries closer than the scholastics in the Middle Ages to find the exact answer to that question.
That's terrific.
I'm sure we can look forward to a lot.
No, I really appreciate your time, Father. Thank you so much for joining me in the lounge room, and I really look forward to having another great conversation with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and likewise, I look forward to it in the future.